Hey everybody, so we're at Unit 2 for Learning Module 3. We're still in the 16th century, but we've moved on a number of years to the Elizabethan court, right? So a little bit of historical background. Elizabeth sort of, with the way that the feudal tenures have broken up and sort of the land system and everything like that, Elizabeth has really sort of consolidated power both at home, right? Protestantism is now the official religion of England, right? It's no longer the sort of like pseudo Catholic, pseudo Protestant religion that was under Henry. This is a distinctly Protestant country, and they are in many ways reacting against any sort of lingering Catholic influences, right? You see that not only in the country, but you also see that internationally, right? The relationship, the very fraught relationship that England has with Spain and also with France. And you also see the beginning of England becoming a world power with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. And that was basically Spain's attempt to basically depose Elizabeth as a Protestant monarch. And they, because of their religious differences, they saw each other as threats to one another's sovereignty. And so this leads them into conflict, right? Religion oftentimes breeds conflict, especially in this period. And so the Elizabethan court is a huge hub for political power, right? It's a huge hub for literary culture, right? Elizabeth was not a direct patron of drama, as some people have, sort of like as part of popular, common understanding. However, people associated with the Elizabethan court did patronize drama directly. She did have her own company, but patronage was more. She had a company named after her, right? She also appoints a master of the revels to sort of oversee theatrical productions, right, and bring court performances. But usually, as far as payments are concerned, her people in her court would pay to have theater troops come to the Elizabethan court. She did not sort of like lay out the money herself, right? It was sort of a gift to the monarch to do that. I'll get a little more into that in drama, right? But she had a lot of artists and people in part of her court, but usually as they fulfilled military positions, right? Sidney, Philip Sidney had a military post, a number of military posts during Elizabeth's tenure, right? As did Edmund Spencer, right? He was, posted in Ireland for a number of years, right? And these people did not make their money off of literature. This is still sort of the way things are going, right? For the Fairy Queen, which I'll talk about later, Edmund Spencer does get a small pension because the Fairy Queen is sort of dedicated to Elizabeth, right? So you start to see people making some money for their literary output, but they're mostly in the court as courtiers and as poets, but primarily as people, people working in the court, filling various political military posts, right? Shakespeare being an exception. Shakespeare was not a member of the Elizabethan court. Shakespeare made most of his money from the theater, right? Um, as did Marlowe for that matter. Now, as far as literary form is concerned, we're still working primarily with sonnets, right? And all three of the sonneteers that we're looking at, Shakespeare, Sidney, and Spencer, writes sonnet sequences, right? Shakespeare's sonnets, Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, and Spencer's Amaridian and Epithalamion, right? These sonnet sequences usually have some sort of a loose narrative, but it's hard to sort of discern any real distinct narrative there, right? Because there are a lot of digressions. It's not linear by any means, right? And a lot of the poems are sort of meditative. They're sort of single subject. They talk about a particular person. You know, for Spencer, it is his who will become his second wife. For Sidney, it is Stella, who some believe to be Penelope Rich, right? A woman who a love relationship between him and this woman sort of fell through. For Shakespeare, it's two people, right? The first chunk of the poems are directed at the Dark Lady, who's believed to be his mistress, and then the rest are sorry, the the last few poems are directed at the Dark Lady, believed to be his mistress. The first 120 some poems are directed at a young man who is thinking about contemplating marriage. Right. Some believe it to be Henry Wriothesley. who was a patron of Shakespeare's. Shakespeare had dedicated some of his short narrative poems to Henry Wriothesley, but it's not entirely clear who it's aimed at, right? Um, Sort of lost in the mystery of history, as it were. But they all do very different things with the sonnet, right? Sidney's sonnet is used as an exploration of folly, right? You'll notice that Sidney, the Astrophil character, behaves rather impulsively, right? And it's investigating his own behavior. It's also investigating the idea of writing, right? The first sonnet really gets into the whole process of writing. How much of an intellectual activity is it? How much invention should be an intellectual activity, or how much it should just sort of be felt and, sort of like almost like coming from a muse, right? Sort of a seamless process, right? Shakespeare, in his sonnets, oftentimes creates problems at the end of his sonnets as opposed to solving them, right? So the structure is almost lined up so that we start with a problem or an issue, we explore it, we explicate it a bit, and then we come to some sort of a resolution. Sidney's sonnet number 1 comes to a resolution when he says, just basically, write. You know what I mean? Forget about everything, forget about all the things keeping you from writing, and just write. With Shakespeare, he likes to problematize things even more, right? His conclusions are not very, there's not a lot of closure, and oftentimes in a Shakespeare sonnet, right? And Spenser, what's interesting about Spenser, he does follow in the line of a Surrey with a lot of the sugared, emotional, colorful language and imagery, right? But what's interesting about Spenser's sonnet sequence, which is distinct from most of the other sonnet sequences, is that his ends happily, right? His ends with the marriage to his wife Elizabeth, right? Um, which does not happen. There's no happy ending. There's no, the speaker of the sonnet and the young man do not fall in love and get together, right? So there are some homoerotic undertones there. Their relationship is not consummated, and the relationship that he has with his mistress is consummated, but it's not a happy relationship, right? So Shakespeare really likes to mess around with the sonnet, not just in its structure, but also in its themes, right? You have an unwilling man and a very available woman, right? Whereas usually the man is the one who is willing and the woman is not willing. The woman is resistant to the man's um, um, advances, right? But this Shakespeare totally messes with and flips around the gender dynamics there. And Sidney is sort of more of a traditionalist in that way, but you do get the sense that he is investigating other things besides just love. He's investigating sort of himself, personal folly, and the craft of writing. And Shakespeare does that as well, and Spenser does that as well. So you'll notice as you're reading, you'll see a lot of poems on meditating on the idea of what it means to be a good writer, right? And also posterity is a big thing, right? How will people remember me? And also, how will people remember my poetic subject, right? So a lot of people remember Sidney, Shakespeare, and Spenser, but they don't necessarily remember um, the people that they were writing about. So I think it's interesting the fact that they're trying to immortalize their subject through their poetry, but by writing poetry, they themselves have become sort of immortal, right? So that's just a little interesting observation on my part. Do with it what you will. And so when you move forward reading these, I want you to think about the differences between what you've seen in Wyatt and Surrey and what you see now with Shakespeare, Spenser, and Sidney. They're sort of following in stylistically. They're sort of following in Surrey's footsteps because they write in the English sonnet in the iambic pentameter, right? But they also do take some things from Wyatt. So I want you to pay attention to some of the overlaps there and think of them as people, working within the court. Think of them as negotiating power relationships and things like that. And other than that, I think I hope that gives you enough to go on. Marlowe is a very sensual poet, and the images there are very sensual. He always likes to sort of relate to places, use images of places, and also because he's following an Ovid sort of like amorous poetry. So you have to think of Marlowe as in many ways a very sexual and very sort of like emphasis on the body, and the material body, right, and flesh and things like that. That's sort of Marlowe's game. More of these things you'd be able to see if you read Hero and Leander, but I'm just having you read The Passionate Shepherd. That's all I have, and I hope that helps you get a good start. And if you have any questions, please, as always,